helping people cope with and overcome life's challenges. This is Life Transformations with Michael Hart, certified Christian counselor and director of Ottawa's Elim Counselling Services.
Hi, I am Michael Hart, Director of Elim Counselling Service, a Christian counseling ministry in Ottawa, and I want to thank you for listening to this edition of Life Transformation, a Christian counseling radio show where chains are broken and lives are transformed. If you're not familiar with Elim Counseling, you can learn more about us at www.elimcounselingministry.com. Elim provides professional counseling from a Christian perspective for Christian couples and families. With me in studio today is Melissa Waggott, who is our ministry assistant. And today we will be discussing 7 negative thought patterns that are identified by psychologists in depressed individuals. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you, Michael, for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here today. So, Michael, before you begin to discuss these thought patterns that you spoke about that have been identified by psychologists, could you tell me a little bit more about what the Bible has to say about the importance of thoughts?
Certainly. We see in passages such as Romans 12, verse 1, where it talks about, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. So the mind is very, very important in transforming a person's life, a person's outlook, a person's emotional state. We also read in Proverbs that as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. So thoughts are very important to determine one's physical state, one's feelings, one's emotions, and one's sense of well-being, and scriptures back that up.
Okay. So one of the negative patterns that I saw in one of the articles you wrote was called catastrophizing. Would you be able to explain to the listeners a little bit more about what this means?
Yes, catastrophizing is when a person takes an event that they're concerned about and exaggerate it to the point where they become really, really distressed and fearful about future outcomes. So we see that in situations, for example, a person might fail an exam. Let us take that as a situation. So a person in university fails one exam, and they can go from failing that one exam to feeling as if they're going to drop out of university or that they'll never get a job again in the future. So that's an example of catastrophizing.
So you give the example of real life that I'm sure we all can relate to about failing that exam and that stress and fear that comes with that. Is there anything in the Bible that speaks to this concept?
Absolutely. We see an example of catastrophizing in the story of Elijah in 1 Kings 19. In that story, we see that Elijah was threatened by Jezebel that she was going to kill him. And Elijah, that God had protected from her because she had been looking for him for quite a while and was not able to locate him. The Bible tells us that when they would say that Elijah was in one place, the Spirit of God would move him to somewhere else so that they were not able to find him. But out of this threat that Jezebel had of placed on Elijah's life, Elijah became so fearful that he started saying things like, I am worse than my ancestors, take my life, Lord, and he became really, really distressed. He said, I am the only one left of all your prophets. So Elijah became very, very distressed and magnified the threat that Jezebel made on his life. He turned it into a catastrophe. Can you imagine feeling like that? You're the last of God's prophet, and like all the hope of the future of God's plan is laying on your shoulders.
That's a huge burden. I can only imagine that poor guy thinking all that and that weight that's just all encompassing, how depressing really that is. And you can see how that's one of those thought patterns that you identified. Another one that's brought up in the article is something called mind reading. And I'm sure in our minds we have a concept of what mind reading is, but can you explain a little bit about what mind reading is for someone who's maybe in a little bit of a depressive state?
Right. So mind reading takes place in depressed individuals when they are able to draw conclusions from a person's action without having evidence to verify it. So an example of that would be, your best friend passed you in, on the street without saying hello. And you take from that, oh, this person doesn't like me anymore. They probably think I am not a good friend, and they're never going to talk to me again because they're mad with me about something. And there is just no evidence to back that up. So that person is reading an incident and judging from it what their friend is actually thinking and planning to do.
So you say there's no evidence to back it up. How do you help someone then to kind of rationalize that there is no evidence for that and sort of get through that cyclical kind of thought process there?
That's a very, very good question. So in a situation like that, we have what we do in sessions, we have a tool that we call the thought record sheet that would help a person to say, well, let us sit down and look at this situation. What are the facts that we know? So that would be called the event. Your friend passed you on the street without saying hello. What then are the evidence that support that your friend is never going to talk to you again? Right? Is there evidence for that? Is there other things that have occurred between you and your friend that makes you feel that the relationship is going to end just as a result of the facts that you know? And what we find in many situations is that once we begin to look at the facts supporting and also the facts against and the facts supporting a person's conclusion, people are able to see very clearly that they're blowing things out of proportion.
Maybe they just didn't see you. They were busy going in their own things and just didn't see you.
So that's actually one of the things we do on the thought record sheet. We looked at what are some of the possible explanations for what happened. What's a more balanced way of looking at the situation. So a person may come to the conclusion, you know what, they are busy studying for their final exam and their mind is probably taken up and getting to class. And as a result of that, there is a better sense that one has once they look at the pros and the cons to justify their thought.
Excellent. Another thought pattern that's been identified in research has been this concept of all or nothing thinking. Can you go into that a little bit more for us?
Yeah, so all or nothing thinking, we see this in people that we call perfectionists. We all have friends like those. Oh, yes.
The finger's being pointed at myself right now. This is a good concept for me.
Yeah, so we see situations where a person might get an A- on an exam, right? And instead of being happy, why I got an A- and I am in the top 5% of the class, this person could become really, really very stressed and very, very disappointed because they didn't get an A+ or they didn't finish at the top of the class. So even though I passed, even though I'm getting an A-, it's not good enough because I didn't finish at the top of the class, or I didn't get 100%. So that's an example of all or nothing. I will not be happy unless I have the highest.
And I find that one interesting because I think it's self-driven too, but sometimes you have external drivers too that are saying, if you're not the best, you're not good enough. So is that something sometimes with your clients or with people experiencing these things you work through, sort of what's from you and also what's maybe values you grew up with about being the best or success?
That's a very, very good point, Melissa, because when we do background work with clients, we look at family of origin and where are some of these negative thought patterns coming from. And what we find in perfectionists is that usually there is a dad or a mom that would be very hard on the person. One client would tell me that they would come home with a 93% and the dad's first question is, what happened to the other 7%? So in a situation, in growing up in a home environment like that, a person can end up developing this thought that I'm a failure unless I get, the absolute maximum in any given test.
And do you find people after they work through that sort of feeling a bit free from that pressure, or does it take some time for them to kind of accept that?
Well, it takes time, but I guess when people are able to see the root and are able to begin to look at things, a more rational way, we find that they're able to be less hard on themselves and less able to look at things in a more realistic and positive point of view than just feeling down because they didn't live up to the expectation of someone else.
So the fourth thought pattern that we're talking about today is something called negative prediction. I've never heard of this before, and so reading it was interesting, but can you explain to some of our listeners who maybe have never heard this concept, what's that all about?
Negative prediction. So negative prediction an example of that would be a person who as an interview, for example, for a job. So you had an interview for a job and you begin to predict that, you know what, I'll never get this job. And, I'm going to be unemployed for the rest of my life. Nobody's going to hire me. Yeah. And I am destined for failure. I'll never be able to buy a house. People even go to those extreme where it goes from just, okay, did I do good in this interview or not, to making predictions about their future and making very negative predictions. So one of the reasons people become depressed when they have these negative thought patterns is that as you think, as the Bible says, a man think in his heart, so is he. So if you begin to think these kind of negative thoughts, I will never get a job, for example, as a result of how you feel about an interview and making that negative prediction, then what ends up happening is you begin to also act in negative ways. So not only are your thought patterns negative, but if you're in a situation where you feel that you will never get a job and you will never be able to succeed at anything, it in turn affects your actions. Okay. So a person goes from just having the thought to now acting in negative ways. So some of the negative ways that a person might act as a result of these negative thought patterns is that they might stop sending out resumes, for example. Right? If you're never going to get a job and you are,
what's the point?
What's the point? You have actually convinced yourself. That's right. What's the point? You have convinced yourself, I have flunked this interview. No one is going to hire me. So they become demotivated. They become distressed, and they're no longer desirous of sending out applications for job. Now, if you're just joining us, you're listening to Life Transformation, a Christian counseling radio show by Elim Counseling Service. And I'm your host, Michael Hart, Director of Elim Counseling Service. With me in studio today is Melissa Waggott, and we are discussing 7 negative thought patterns that have been identified in depressed individuals by psychologists. So far we have talked about catastrophizing, which is a way of blowing things way out of proportion. A person becomes even more depressed as a result of a negative incident because all they can think of is the catastrophe that will occur as a result of that. We talked about mind reading, which is the second negative thought pattern, and mind reading occurs in situations where a person makes judgment about what's going on in someone else's mind, and in most cases these thoughts are negative, and that's why a person ends up being depressed. Then Melissa, you and I also talked about the third way of negative thought pattern, which is all or nothing thinking, and we talked about that, an example of a person who is not satisfied with a 93 on an exam, and
they're looking for that 7%, and
right.
And if you don't get it,
right, the focus becomes more on the 7% that is not there than on the 93% that's there. And then we talked about negative prediction, and the example I used there is of a person who predicts a lot of negative about the future as a result of feeling that they didn't do good on a job interview. And I also touched on the interaction between thoughts, feelings, and actions. And actually, Melissa, that's one of the foundation for cognitive behavior therapy, because cognitive behavior therapist believes that there is an interaction between a person's thought, their actions, and their feelings, and that the type of thoughts and the type of actions will determine how a person actually ends up feeling.
Yeah, from what I'm getting from this half of our interview is it seems like a very vicious cycle people can get trapped in, and that interaction between the thoughts, actions, and feelings is so important. Because I think sometimes when you talk about depression, it's, well, just feel better. But it's so much more than that, is what I'm hearing from you, with these different types of thought patterns you can get trapped in, really, is what it sounds like.
Absolutely. If it was as simple as just snap out of it, as some people have been told, or just have faith and so forth, then it would be an easier thing. No one would choose to be depressed. But you mentioned the word vicious cycle, or the words vicious cycle, and I think that's such a good description of what it is. Because as you begin to think negative thoughts, and you begin to, as a result of those thoughts, behave in negative ways, that in turn affects the quality of your future thoughts, which even makes it more negative, which in turns develop in even more negative actions, which in turns leads to worst feelings. So in our counseling sessions with people who are struggling with depression, one of the things that we do is that we start focusing on the nature, what is the nature of the thought and the nature of the actions that are being displayed by the individuals we see. So we realize as cognitive behavior therapists that we can't change a person's feeling directly. So you use the example, we can't tell someone to snap out of it, right?
Yes, exactly.
Right. But we can tell a person to begin to look at their situation in a more rational way and help them to do so by the means of therapeutic tools. And we can also help a person to begin to act in more positive ways, so that they, instead of it being a vicious cycle spiraling downwards, this cycle can now spiral upwards. And there have been studies that have been done that shows that cognitive behavior therapy is as effective are more effective than medication, and that over time the results of cognitive behavior therapy tend to be more longer lasting than people who turn to just antidepressant for their cure.
That's excellent. The next type of negative thought pattern that you've identified as people getting stuck in is something called overgeneralization. What is that all about?
Overgeneralization is an example of that would be where, if we use the example of the test that we talked about, a person did a test and got a 93. Let's take it, let's develop a different scenario regarding that test. Let us say that this person failed the test. So it was a bad score. You got like maybe say a 50 or a 45 out of 100, and the person is really very, very disappointed and stressed as a result of failing that exam. Overgeneralization in that case, a person could say, well, not only did I fail this test, but I am a failure in life. I am not a good person. So the negative experience of the test is now transposed to the other areas of life. If I may use another example of that in relationships, we see examples of that where in situations such as a husband who criticizes a wife's cooking, for example. Maybe this meal didn't turn out the way the others did, and the husband makes some off-the-cuff remark. And in some situations, we have seen where some wives go from that to thinking, I am a bad wife. I am not a good wife, or I am not a good person even, or you don't love me.
Yep.
So it's not just that you don't love the meal that I cooked, but it's now generalized
to every aspect
of a person's life.
That you just feel the weight of someone who's in that sort of trap of that type of thinking. The next type of thinking, and I think you have actually an example of how this relates even from the Bible, is something called selective abstraction.
Yes. Selective abstraction is when a person takes one set of facts from all the possible facts that they could look at, and hold up that fact as the evidence for their negative ways of thinking. So we have an example of that in the story of Elijah, where Elijah became depressed because of a threat that Jezebel made on his life. Now, if we look at the previous chapters before 1 Kings 19, we'll see that God protected Elijah from Jezebel. We'll see that God provided for him miraculously while he was in hiding. We'll see that God was with him in many different ways in the mighty miracles that he performed. But Elijah became focused on one aspect of his life at that time. He selected one aspect, and that is he became focused on the threat. And as he focused on that threat, the selective abstraction, just that was selecting that one negative possibility, Elijah became the mighty man of God, the man who did many miracles, the man who God protected and provided for, became fearful. And the Bible tells us in 1 Kings 19 that he was under a tree praying to God for God to take his life.
Kill him,
yeah. And I think we should talk a little bit here about the fact that Elijah's depression wasn't caused by any lack of spirituality.
And I think that's an important point you bring up, because I know sometimes as Christians you hear, well, the joy of the Lord, and just pray and it'll get you through. But it's encouraging that even a guy like Elijah and all that he did can get in that negative thought pattern, but he reached out to God.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's if you think about it, Elijah was very close to God, because just before his depression, we saw him performing a mighty miracle on Mount Carmel, where he called down fire from heaven.
Yes. Yes, exactly.
So when you think about being in touch with God and seeing God moving in your life, Elijah's depression wasn't caused by any lack of faith. As we examine this story more closely, we can come to the conclusion that his depression was caused by maybe a lack of attention to personal self-care. Because once he we can see from the story that maybe he overexerted himself in serving God, to the point where some researchers think he suffered from a burnout.
That weary and well-doing. We're giving to everyone else and helping everyone, but sometimes we forget our own person. So the last negative thought pattern we're going to talk about today is something called magnification or minimization. Can you elaborate on that a little bit further?
Right. It's that magnification and minimization is kind of similar to selective abstraction. The main difference is that the person focuses on both minimizes the positive and at the same time maximizes the negative. Okay, so let us say that you did good on a speech and your fear is public speaking, right? So you're thinking like, wow. You could be thinking, I did really good on this speech, but a person could minimize that to say, well, yes, but it was just by luck that I did well. Or, yeah, it wasn't really that good, but they just didn't want to boo me,
That'll never happen again.
It will never happen again. So they're actually thinking about the positive, but they're minimizing the positive, but at the same time they're maximizing the negative, and maybe the negative was just one incident where someone in the crowd wasn't clapping at the speech.
But that was enough.
Everyone else was clapping, but there was this one person who had a sour look on his or her face, and the person goes into thinking, yes, the other applause doesn't mean anything. They're just being nice, but this one person who isn't clapping, this is because my speech really is very, very awful. So you can see how a person does that. And an example of that is also found in the story of Elijah, because you can see that Elijah was mindful, he was cognizant of the fact that he was a prophet. So when he said, I am the only one left of your prophet, he said, yes, God, you have protected me, you have done all of these good things, but I am the only one left.
I'm all by myself.
I am all by myself now, right? And now they're trying to kill me too. And we see from scriptures that when people have these kind of negative thought patterns, that usually it's not the thoughts are not rational and cannot be substantiated by the facts. Because when God eventually came to Elijah and spoke to Elijah, God had to correct his faulty thinking by saying, Elijah, you're not the only one left. As a matter of fact, there are 7,000 others.
You are not alone.
Yeah, 7,000 others like you who have not bowed to Baal. So he was a little bit off in his prediction there, right?
But sometimes you need that person to kind of snap you back and challenge those thoughts, as you talked about earlier, and highlight the reality of the situation. So my final question to you, Michael, is if someone's sitting at home right now and listening to this and thinking, you've just described me, or you've described a loved one or someone I know, I've seen this thinking in my own life or in the life of someone I love or care about, what advice can you give to those people, and what types of approaches do you use in your own therapy ministry to help people through these relatively common but so destructive thought patterns that we can get ourselves stuck into?
So I guess the first part is if you're at home and you're identifying with any one of these thought patterns that we have talked about, it's a sign that maybe you need help to begin to break the cycle of those negative thoughts. And especially if you're suffering from feelings of depression or feeling down, maybe it's not full-blown depression, but you just have these feelings of sadness that are with you all the time, then it might be time for you to look at getting help, because in sessions, in answering that part of your question, they're very practical work that we do to not only identify the thought, but also to break that cycle of thought, to break those thought patterns so that a person can begin to think more positively about their lives. So unfortunately, we have come near to the end of today's broadcast. And Melissa, I want to thank you so much for being with me here today in discussing this very interesting and important topic.
It was a pleasure being with you, Michael. I really learned a lot, and thank you for sharing your experience and expertise with us.
Thank you very much. It was my pleasure. If you're listening to today's show and you're going through any feelings of depression, then help is only a call away. You can call me, Michael Hart, at Elim Counselling Service at 613-699-1677. Again, 613-699-1677. I can also be contacted by email at mhart, that's HART, at Elim Counselling with 2 L's, elimcounsellingministry.com. We're also interested in your questions and any topics that you would like to see discussed on the show. Please contact us and we will make a note of it and maybe discuss those topics in future shows. Thank you very much for listening to this edition of Life Transformation, an Elim Counselling Service radio show. Until next time, this is your host, Michael Hart, praying that God would grant you happiness in all your relationships and keep you sound in mind and pure in heart. God bless you, and thank you for listening.